She was sitting on a bench outside the Kroger on Elm Street, and I almost drove past her. It was the Suitcases that stopped me. Two of them, the old navy blue ones I'd bought her for her 30th birthday, sitting on the sidewalk like they'd been dropped there in a hurry. My daughter was beside them, with her head down, one arm around my granddaughter, who was pressed into her side the way children press into their mothers when they are frightened, but trying not to show it. My granddaughter is 7. She was wearing her school backpack. I pulled into the lot and sat in the car for a moment before I got out. Not because I was deciding what to do. I knew what I was going to do the second I saw those suitcases. I sat there because I needed 30 seconds to put my face back together before my daughter looked up and saw me. She didn't cry when she saw me walk across that parking lot. That told me everything. When a woman has been crying for a long time, she runs out. She just looked at me with those hollow eyes and said, "Mom." That was all. Just my name. The way you say it when you're finally somewhere safe. I sat down on that bench and put my arm around her, and my granddaughter climbed into my lap without being asked, even though she's too old for that now and normally acts like it. I held them both and I looked out at the parking lot and I said, "Tell me." She told me. It had started 2 weeks before, though I think, in truth, it had been building for longer than that. Her mother-in-law had never made a secret of the fact that she considered my daughter beneath her son. Not in the way people say those things outright. It was always smaller than that. A comment about my daughter's neighborhood growing up. A silence when my daughter spoke at family dinners. A habit of directing every question about the children or the house to her son, as though my daughter were a guest at her own table. My son-in-law. And I am trying to be precise here because I want you to understand exactly what kind of man he is. My son-in-law let it happen every single time. He would look at his plate or change the subject or say something vague like, "Let's not do this tonight," and then pour himself another glass of wine. And my daughter would sit there and absorb it and smile and clean up after dinner while his mother sat in the living room and let her. They had been living in his mother's house. That was the arrangement when they first got married. Temporary, they said, just until they saved enough for a down payment. That was 4 years ago. The house was large enough, a colonial on a cul-de-sac in a subdivision outside of Raleigh, and my son-in-law's mother, I will call her what my granddaughter calls her, Grandma Hester, because that is the only name she was ever given in this house. Grandma Hester had made it quietly, persistently clear that it was her house, her rules, her table, her opinion that mattered. 2 weeks before I found my daughter on that bench, Grandma Hester had told my son-in-law that my daughter was a bad influence on the children. She had said this at dinner, apparently clearly enough for my daughter to hear from the kitchen. My daughter came to the doorway and asked what that meant. Grandma Hester looked at her son and said, "You know what it means." My son-in-law said, "Mom, please." That was all he said. That night, my daughter told me later, she went to bed before everyone else and lay there in the dark and thought about every time she had let something go, every comment, every silence. Every holiday where she had smiled and passed the casserole and pretended not to notice. She said she counted them like beads on a string. She lost count around 40. The next morning, Grandma Hester told her son that she wanted my daughter out of the house by the end of the month. My son-in-law was in the kitchen when she said it. My daughter was getting my granddaughter ready for school in the next room. The walls in that house are not thick. She heard every word. She waited until my granddaughter was on the bus. Then she walked into the kitchen and she looked at her husband and she said, "Are you going to say something?" He looked at his coffee cup. She said, "I need you to say something." He looked up at her and he said, "She's not wrong that things have been tense." My daughter picked up her daughter's backpack from the hook by the door, set it on the counter, packed 3 days of clothes into it, and called the car. That was 10 days ago. She had not called me. I want to say that first before I explain why, because I know that's the thing a person wonders. She had not called me because she was ashamed, and not of herself. She told me this clearly, but of the situation. She had watched me work my entire life to make sure she never had to sit on a bench outside a grocery store. I had a business. Not a large one, but mine. A property management company I had built over 30 years, starting with 2 rental units I'd bought with the insurance money after her father died and I was 34 years old, with a daughter in kindergarten and a mortgage that felt like a stone on my chest. 30 years. 12 properties now, commercial and residential both. She knew what I had done to build it, and she was ashamed to have to call and say, "I am sitting on a bench outside a Kroger with your granddaughter and 2 suitcases." She hadn't wanted to tell me she'd married the wrong man, but someone who knew her, a friend from her old neighborhood, a woman named Cecilia who still kept in touch with me from the years I drove carpool. Cecilia had seen her 2 days earlier at a laundromat across town and texted me. Not to alarm me, just to say, "I saw your daughter. Is everything okay?" I'd driven to that Kroger on a hunch and a prayer. My granddaughter looked up at me from my lap and said, "Grandma, when are we going home?" I looked at my daughter over the top of her head. I said, "We're going home right now, baby." And we did. My house has 4 bedrooms, which is too many for one person, but I've never been willing to sell it because I always knew I might need them. My daughter and my granddaughter took the 2 rooms at the end of the hall, the ones with the window seat and the backyard view. And the first night I made chicken and rice and we ate at the kitchen table and did not talk about any of it. We watched a movie my granddaughter chose. We went to bed. The next morning, I called my attorney. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I knew exactly what to do. I do not mean I acted in anger. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband, built a business from nothing, raised a child alone, and survived enough winters to know that anger is expensive. What I felt sitting across from my attorney, a woman named Rosalind who has handled my business contracts for 11 years, was not anger. It was clarity. I told Rosalind everything my daughter had told me. What concerned me most was not the emotional cruelty, though that was real and it had done real damage. What concerned me was the financial situation. My daughter had no independent accounts. They had shared everything, 1 checking account, 1 savings account, both at a bank where her mother-in-law's family had been customers for 40 years. My son-in-law handled the bills. My daughter worked part-time as a dental hygienist, 2.5 days a week, because they had agreed early in the marriage that she would reduce her hours when they had children. Her income went directly into that shared account. She had not had her own account since the year they were married. She did not have access to any of it now. Her husband had not cut her off explicitly. He had simply stopped responding to her texts. She had tried twice to use the debit card at a gas station and it had declined. She had not told me this at the bench. She had told me quietly the second morning while my granddaughter was still asleep. I put $5,000 into a new account in her name that afternoon. Then I called Rosalind back. The separation agreement was the first step. North Carolina is not a community property state, but marital assets are equitable distribution, and 4 years of my daughter's income deposited into that shared account was marital property regardless of whose name was on the account. The car she drove was in her name. The furniture in those 4 rooms was technically community property, but Rosalind told me not to worry about the furniture. "Let him keep the couch," Rosalind said. I said, "Fine." What I was more interested in was this. My son-in-law worked for his mother's company, a small landscaping business that Grandma Hester's late husband had started in the 90s and that she had run ever since, and that my son-in-law had taken over the daily operations of 6 years ago. He had a salary. He had a company truck. He had a health insurance plan that currently covered my daughter and granddaughter. Rosalind said the health insurance continuation was straightforward. COBRA would apply, but she wanted me to understand the full picture before we proceeded. "The full picture," I said. She set down her pen. "You told me his mother said your daughter was a bad influence. You told me she said she wanted her out. And then you told me your son-in-law froze the account." "Yes," I said. And your daughter worked for the dental practice 3 days a week. 2.5, I said. Dr. Daughter worked for the dental practice 3 days a week. Alderman's office on Glenwood. She's been there 6 years. Rosalind nodded slowly. She said, "Is she still employed there?" I did not know. I called my daughter that evening and asked her. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that Dr. Perseling, Alderman, had called her the previous week and told her, very apologetically, that he needed to reduce his staff and her position was being eliminated. Dr. Alderman had been a patient of Grandma Hester's husband for 30 years. His office building was managed by a property company whose owner played golf every Thursday with Grandma Hester's brother-in-law. I sat in my kitchen after I got off the phone and I looked out the window at the backyard where my granddaughter was playing on the old swing set I had never taken down. And I thought about how small a town Raleigh can be if you know the right people. And I thought about how that works in both directions. I have managed properties in this city for 30 years. I have sat on the board of the Raleigh Small Business Association for 9 of those years. I have a current lease with the building that houses the Glenwood Family Dental Center. I am the landlord. I called Dr. Alderman the next morning. I did not threaten him. I want that to be very clear. I called him and I introduced myself by my full name, because he knew the name on the lease but had never connected it to his hygienist's mother. And I told him I'd heard he was making some staffing changes and I wanted to check in. He was very quiet on the phone. I let him be quiet. Then I said I hoped he was satisfied with the building because the lease renewal was coming up in the spring and I had every intention of keeping good tenants. He called my daughter the following afternoon and offered her full-time hours and a raise. But that was just the beginning. What I actually needed to understand was the landscaping company. Because Grandma Hester had, for reasons I was about to discover were not entirely innocent, been very determined to get my daughter out of that house quickly. And when someone is in that much of a hurry, I have learned, it is usually because they are afraid of something being found. Rosalind had a contact. Not a private investigator exactly, but a woman who did what Rosalind called asset research for divorce proceedings. Her name was Marlene, and she was 61 years old and had been doing this work for 20 years, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and reminded me of a librarian and was absolutely ruthless. I liked her immediately. Marlene took 3 weeks. At the end of those 3 weeks, she came back to Rosalind's office and set a folder on the table, and I sat across from both of them and read what was inside. Grandma Hester's landscaping company had been misrepresenting its revenue to qualify for small business development grants through the state of North Carolina. Not enormous amounts, but consistent. Over 5 years, the company had received 4 separate grants totaling just under $200,000, all of which had been applied for using financial statements that overstated expenses and understated revenue in a very specific way that made the business appear to qualify for assistance it did not, in fact, qualify for. My son-in-law had signed the applications. He was the operations manager. His signature was on every one. I looked at Marlene across the table. She looked back at me through her reading glasses. Rosalind said quietly, "This is a matter for the State Attorney General's office." I said, "Yes, it is." I said it calmly. I said it the way you say a thing when you have already thought it through completely and you know exactly where it leads. What I did next was deliberate and careful, and I did not do any of it in a hurry. First, my daughter filed for separation with Rosalind's help. North Carolina requires a 1-year separation before divorce is final. The paperwork was filed on a Tuesday, and my son-in-law was served at his mother's house on a Thursday afternoon. I was told he stood in the doorway and read the papers twice and then went inside without saying anything. Second, Rosalind made an anonymous referral to the North Carolina Department of Commerce regarding the grant applications. She did this correctly, through the appropriate channels with documentation. Marlene had organized everything clearly. It was not a vendetta. It was a report. What the state chose to do with it was up to the state. Third, my daughter enrolled in a full-time hygienist position, the one Dr. Alderman had reinstated. And I helped her find a family law attorney separate from Roslyn, a woman who specialized in equitable distribution. Her name was Teresa, and she was 44 years old and had a reputation in Raleigh family court that made my son-in-law's attorney visibly uncomfortable at the first mediation session, from what my daughter described. I was not at that mediation session. I waited at home and made soup. The state investigation took 8 months. I will not pretend I know all the details of what happened inside it, because I do not. What I know is what became public record. Grandma Hester's company was found to have received grant funding it was not eligible for. There were fines. There was a repayment demand. There was a period during which the company could not bid on certain municipal contracts, which is the kind of consequence that, for a landscaping business whose growth had depended on those contracts, is quietly devastating. My son-in-law resigned from the company in the 6th month of the investigation. I do not know if that was his mother's decision or his own. The equitable distribution was settled 9 months after my daughter filed. She received half the value of the marital savings account, which was more substantial than I had expected. It turned out my son-in-law had been contributing significantly to it, while my daughter believed they were saving slowly. There was also a settlement on the car and a child support agreement for my granddaughter. My daughter did not get everything she might have wanted, but she got enough to start. The last piece happened without my planning it. There is a women's business association in Raleigh that I have been a member of for 20 years. Every spring, they hold a luncheon. That year, I was asked to speak, not about anything in particular, just about 30 years of building something in a city that did not always make it easy. I agreed, and I stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in April, and I talked about the years after my husband died. The years when I had nothing but a mortgage and 2 rental units and a daughter in kindergarten, and the absolute certainty that I would figure it out. I talked about the women who had helped me, the accountant who stayed late to walk me through my first business tax return, the neighbor who watched my daughter on the mornings I had to meet contractors, the attorney who took my calls on Saturday mornings without billing me for them. I talked about what it means to have someone in your corner. My daughter was in the audience. She was in the 3rd row in a blue blazer I had not seen before, and her daughter was in school, and she was sitting up straight with her hands folded in her lap. She looked like herself. Not the woman on the bench, herself. I said at the end that the most important thing I had ever learned in business was also the most important thing I had ever learned as a mother. That power is not about what you take from people. It is about what you build. And when someone tries to take from you what you have built, your dignity, your financial independence, your sense of who you are and what you are worth, the answer is not rage. The answer is patience and documentation and the willingness to use every legitimate tool available to you. The answer is knowing who you are before they try to tell you who you're not. After the luncheon, my daughter found me near the coat check. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just held my arm. Then she said, "I should have called you sooner." I said, "You called me when you needed to." We drove home in separate cars and met at my house for dinner. And my granddaughter showed us a picture she had drawn at school of our family, me and my daughter and herself, standing in front of a house with a very large yard and a swing set in the back. She had drawn the sun enormous and bright in the upper left corner, the way children do when they are not afraid of taking up space. I looked at that drawing for a long time. That is the only inheritance that matters. Not the properties or the business or the money I spent on attorneys and asset researchers and a $5,000 emergency transfer on a Tuesday afternoon. All of that was just mechanics. The thing that matters is what my daughter knows now, and what her daughter is already learning, that the women in this family do not stay on benches. We get up, we get in the car, and we know exactly where we are going. I think about that bench a lot. Not with anger anymore. That passed a long time ago, but with a kind of quiet recognition. The bench outside that Kroger was the result of 100 small surrenders my daughter had made over 4 years. Each one reasonable seeming on its own, each one a little piece of ground she gave up without realizing she was giving it up. The shared account. The reduced hours. The dinners where she smiled and cleared the plates and said nothing. None of those things felt like a trap when they were happening. They rarely do. That's what I've come to understand. The damage that undoes a person is almost never one large blow. It's the accumulation. It's the slow erosion of believing your own judgment matters. What got my daughter off that bench was not luck. I want to be honest about that. It was a chain of causes with real effects, and if you trace it back far enough, it leads to choices. Hers, mine, and theirs. Grandma Hester made a choice to use her connections to isolate my daughter, and she was disciplined about it. But she also made a choice to falsify grant applications, and she was careless about that. Those two choices were always going to collide with each other eventually. I just made sure I was standing at the right place when they did. What I brought to that situation was not rage, and it was not luck. It was 30 years of knowing how to read a room, how to read a document, and how to be patient when patience is the sharpest tool available. I had made mistakes in my business over the years, real ones, costly ones, and every one of them had taught me something I used in those 8 months. The attorney I called on a Monday morning. The right questions I asked Rosalind. The instinct that told me Marlene's folder was going to matter. None of that came from nowhere. It came from years of paying attention, of taking the work seriously, of refusing to let myself be sloppy even when I was tired or scared or grieving. And my daughter. I watched her change during those months. She came into my house hollow and she left it something else entirely. She did not just sit and wait for me to fix things. She filed the paperwork. She showed up to mediation. She took the full-time position at Dr. Alderman's office, even on the mornings it was hard. She rebuilt her credit. She found Teresa on her own after Rosalind gave her 3 names to consider. She chose the right one. That is not a small thing. That is a woman who is learning to trust her own mind again. And there is nothing more important than that. What I keep coming back to is this. Integrity is not what you do when people are watching. It is what you do in the 4th year of a difficult situation, on a Tuesday, when no one is paying attention and the easier path is right there. Grandma Hester had resources and connections and decades of reputation in that city. What she did not have was the discipline to be honest in the quiet moments. That gap between what she projected and what she actually was is what undid her. My granddaughter drew that picture at school. The enormous sun, the swing set, the 3 of us in front of the house. She did not draw it from fear. She drew it from somewhere solid inside herself, some place that had not been touched by any of what happened. I look at that drawing and I think, this is the only inheritance that actually transfers. Not the money, not the properties, not the business. The willingness to stand up. The clarity to know what is true. The endurance to keep going on the days when everything in you wants to sit back down on the bench. I hope she never forgets she comes from women who get up,